beautiful.
All right, let's get started. Sam, are you there or should I just go? Yeah, Sam Purdy is going to be our part-time tech host tonight, but he's also juggling.
Like 2 minutes, but you can get started. He'll come join.
Okay, yeah, he's getting kids ready for bed. And I'm Shoshana, and I'm your program host, and I'll start with a few little details. The session is being recorded. Our speaker tonight is Rob Forbes, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute. He will be taking questions probably toward the second half of the program. And so as usual, if you have a question or a comment, put that information in the chat box down at the bottom, and you can just write question or comment, and we'll try to take those in the order in which they come. We're going to ask everybody to be muted when you're not asking questions, just so we don't get background noise. It just makes it easier to hear our speaker. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, who is well known to most of us, Rob Forbes, who is a historian, a public and academic historian for almost 3 decades, and he specializes in the intersection of politics, slavery, and race. He earned a PhD from Yale. He served as the founding associate director of Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, and has taught at a number of universities in the area. He lives in New Haven and is a Becky member with his wife, Joanne. His daughter spoke a couple of weeks ago incredibly eloquently, Rachel Forbes, and I'm just constantly getting feedback about how wonderful that is. So I keep passing it along to her parents so that they can shep nachas for the wonderful job they've done in raising such a brilliant and thoughtful and kind daughter. Tonight, Rob's going to talk to us about Juneteenth, which I don't know about any of you, but I never really heard about until fairly recently. But it is an important day of commemorating the end of slavery in America. And has actually, well, Rob will probably tell you lots of interesting details, including, I believe it's just been decided that it's going to be considered a national holiday. Is that correct, Rob? Do I have that
correct? It passed the House 25 minutes ago.
Woohoo!
Go to the president.
So here we are making news and being on the forefront. So Rob, why don't you tell us everything you know about Juneteenth and then some.
Okay. I will do that. Well, Juneteenth refers to June 19th, 1865, the day that the enslaved African Americans of Galveston, Texas, learned that slavery had ended and they were free. Here's the immediate background. Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th. General Johnston surrendered on April 26th in North Carolina, and that essentially meant the end of the Civil War, except for Texas. Texas operated virtually independently from the rest of the Confederacy and the world, and kept on fighting until June. Declaring fatwas against all of the Confederates who had surrendered until they did it themselves. Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston on June 19th and issued General Order Number 3, which read in part, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves." So Jubilee Day became an annual holiday in Galveston and rapidly spread through Texas, often called Emancipation Day. By 1900, it was universally called Juneteenth. It ebbed and flowed in part as Juneteenth celebrations were attacked by by racist mobs, but ultimately it became a state holiday in 1980. And I strongly recommend to you the sort of memoir / history on Juneteenth by my friend Annette Gordon-Reed, who not surprisingly is giving a talk on the same subject at the same moment to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Now, Juneteenth is not the first holiday created by the former slaves. On May 1st, 1865, about 10,000 freed people marched in a solemn parade around the former racetrack in Charleston that had been turned into a prison for Union captives, for Union soldiers. About 264 of them had died and were buried in sort of the infield of the racetrack. And that was really the original Memorial Day. That was the origin of that event. But the memory of that first Memorial Day was lost until 1996, when my former colleague and former boss at Gilder Lehrman, David Blight, rediscovered it in a box of unsorted Union veterans papers in Houghton Library at Harvard. There were also a series of other commemorations that had been celebrated for years. Abolition Day is probably the earliest of these, which commemorated the end of the American and British slave trades in 1808 and was held on July 14th. August 1st, which celebrated the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1834. That was a major holiday among African Americans, starting, I think, mostly in Boston. And September 22nd, marking the day in 1862 that Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and January 1st, the day the actual proclamation took effect in 1863. So where does July 4th fit in this list of dates? That date is more complicated. Obviously, it's the date that the Declaration of Independence was approved, and that date, the 4th of July, was widely viewed as connected to freedom, inevitably, since it was the date of American freedom, but also to emancipation, to slave emancipation. It was the date that the Gradual Emancipation Acts in both New York and New Jersey took effect. But many African Americans viewed, both enslaved and free, viewed Independence Day as a cruel monument to American hypocrisy. And they tended not to observe it, particularly since in many places, drunk white revelers chose to consider assaulting Blacks who had the audacity to gather in public on that day as an indispensable part of the holiday for whites. that doesn't mean that African Americans didn't accept or rejected the meaning of the day. They did not. And in many communities, Blacks celebrated Independence Day on July 5th as a more prudent alternative. All of that changed in 1863. You probably recall that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. This was the high water mark of the Confederacy, the moment at which the tide decisively turned, and the bloodiest day in American military history, with 50,000 casualties. But a more strategically important battle was the final fall of Vicksburg after a many months long siege on July 4th. And that victory was directly attributable. It would not have happened when it happened if it were not for the enlistment of African Americans in the Army. This was the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect with the enlistment of African American troops. And 7,200 Black soldiers are buried in the Vicksburg National Cemetery. That's almost 40% of the about 18,000 Union soldiers who are buried there. And that's more Union soldiers than are buried in any other Civil War cemetery. It's the largest one. So on the following July 4th, freed people celebrated the anniversary of the victory at Vicksburg, and not at Vicksburg itself, but at an island a little bit south of there, and turned Independence Day into a full-fledged festival of freedom, really for the first time. Now, it's an interesting fact, and it makes sense when you think about it, that Southerners rarely celebrated the 4th of July. It was not, they really hadn't celebrated it for decades. And you can sort of see why. Precisely because of its radical message of deliverance and liberation, which was an inflammatory message to project in a slave society. So it fell into essentially disuse in the South. During the Confederacy, the preferred holiday to celebrate was the birthday of George Washington. After the war, the freed people made July 4th fully their own in many places throughout the South, including the Confederate capital of Richmond, where it became the great day of picnicking and celebration for the Blacks, while the whites stayed out of public places and looked on sullenly. So it was only after emancipation that Independence Day could finally embody the true meaning of the Declaration of Independence. General Granger's General Order Number 3 of Juneteenth made the link between the Emancipation Proclamation and the Declaration of Independence explicit. Granger's order cited the proclamation from the executive of the United States as authority for his action. Now, it's often said, especially in recent years, that the Emancipation Proclamation freed no one because it only applied to enslaved people in the areas held by the rebels, in other words, outside of the control of the Union. But I think that's like saying that God didn't free the Israelites, right? They had to get up and leave. So the process of declaring that the Blacks were free was a critical move. And the Emancipation Proclamation did two crucial things that made Juneteenth possible. As I said, it authorized the enlistment of Black troops. And before the end of the war, 10% of the total number of troops who fought for the Union were African American, most of them former slaves. And that is very likely the decisive quotient that turned the tide, guaranteed victory for the Union. The second thing that it did was the key thing it did was to erase the sanction of the federal government for slavery. Up until this time, it's hard for us to realize the massive shift that the Emancipation Proclamation represented, because up until this time, the greatest extent that the government could take in suppressing slavery, according to the Constitution, was to limit its expansion to the territories that Congress had control over. And when there was a proposed constitutional amendment after Lincoln's election and the secession of the first Confederate States, to declare that Congress could never, under any circumstances, end slavery in the states where it already existed. And that passed almost unanimously. It was not in question. That's how complete was the hold that slavery had on the federal government through its essential sanction in the Constitution. As far as Granger was concerned, this meant that the promise of the Declaration was realized. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, he said. The phrase absolute equality does not appear in the Declaration of Independence, but it does not appear in the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's implicit in the Declaration. In fact, it's explicit in the Declaration, but only now could it become fully operative. The self-evident fact that all men were indeed equal and possessed of the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So just like the Israelites in Egypt, Black people got up and moved. In fact, they had been doing so for many decades before the beginning of the Civil War. And they did so with complete conviction that they were part of the same cosmic drama as the Israelites' Exodus. They weren't It wasn't like the Exodus, it was the same thing. The critical early event was when thousands of runaways poured across the Union lines into Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. In the early days of the Civil War, the idea of slavery was so ingrained that even though the Southern states had declared war against the Union, the officers would apply the Fugitive Slave Act and return the slaves who had come within their camp to their putative owners. But this changed at Fort Monroe, and there's a little bit of a strange story there. The commander of Fort Monroe was Ben Butler, who was a racist Massachusetts Democratic politician who had supported the secessionist candidate for president in 1860. He was not a Lincoln supporter. But when this vast influx of blacks came within his ranks, we're talking about tens of thousands, he refused to return them. And he wrote a memorandum to the War Department saying, we can't return them, they will be used against us, and we have no intention of keeping them as slaves. So what are they? And he declared, kind of ingeniously, that these ex-slaves were contraband of war. And they soon took the nickname contrabands. When this vast influx of freed people arrived at Fort Monroe, they were singing a song that was recorded and later published by a Christian missionary. And I'll try to give a rendition of how the song went, the first verse. The Lord by Moses to Pharaoh said, oh, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Oh, let my people go. Oh, go down, Moses, away down to Egypt's land, and tell King Pharaoh to let my people go. This was called, it was published as the Song of the Contrabands. And this is the first recorded Negro spiritual published in 1861. The minister who published it said that the song had been sung by slaves for 9 years. I guess this is what he was told. And that dovetails with Harriet Tubman's statement in her authorized biography of 1868, in which she said that this was one of 2 songs that she sang in the process of leading runaways to freedom. It was encoded with different verses and different tempos that would explain to people whether they should move, whether it was safe to go, or whether they had to stay put. You can sort of follow the course of this process of liberation through the popular songs of the Civil War era. The most notable of these are by a Middletown, Connecticut-born abolitionist named Henry Clay Work, who wrote Kingdom Coming in 1862, in which Massa has run away and the darkies have taken control of the plantation. Babylon is Fallen in 1863, with the chorus, Babylon is fallen, and we's going to occupy the land. It's a difficult song because it's filled with what we take today to be offensive dialect, Negro dialect, but the images of it's not lightning, it's the sun flashing off the darkies' bayonets is pretty powerful. The most important one and the best one is Marching Through Georgia of 1865. Which is a rousing portrayal of Sherman's march to the sea. The chorus there goes, hoorah, hoorah, we bring the Jubilee. Hoorah, hoorah, the flag that makes you free. So we sang the chorus from Atlanta to the sea while we were marching through Georgia. Now, just as with Exodus, the symbolism of the Jubilee was seen as completely literal by the freed people. The reference to the Jubilee appears in Leviticus 25:10. You shall make the 50th year holy and proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. It's significant that the phrase, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, is inscribed on a bell that was cast in Philadelphia in 1752, 25 years before American independence, which in 1839 was renamed Liberty Bell and taken up by the abolitionist movement as a symbol. For African Americans, the language of Exodus and Jubilee was literal and not figurative. It was part of the same sacred story as the Bible, and objectively, if you look at the process of liberation that was taking place that culminated with Juneteenth, it was as momentous as Exodus of the Bible. The traditional number of Israelites crossing the Sea of Reeds was 600,000 adult men, which translates into approximately 2 million people total. And this, almost all biblical scholars consider this to be a pretty vast inflation of the actual number. But the number that were freed in the United States was 4 million. 4 million slaves were freed. Probably the largest slave society that history has ever known. There's only a couple that in very ancient times that may exceed it. The Israelites took with them out of Egypt enough gold, silver, and jewels to build the Mishkan in pretty grand style. Emancipation in the United States instantly annihilated $3 billion in capital. That's the same as the total capital invested in manufacturing, railroads, and livestock in 1860. And it's 64 times that year's federal budget. There's even a parallel in the years of wandering in the wilderness. Instead of 40, you could make a compelling case that the years of wandering lasted for 100 years in the case of the United States. And just as in the Bible, doesn't all end happily ever after. That's the end of the Exodus is only the sixth book of the Bible, and there's a lot left to go. Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, attempted to make sense of the cosmic drama that the nation was undergoing, sounding more like an onlooker and interpreter of God's working in history than an actor in it. All knew that the slave interest was somehow the cause of the war, he said. Neither party anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before, the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not that we be not judged. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. That passage from a very fierce passage in the book of Matthew implied that both the South and the North bore responsibility for the war. In the next passage, Lincoln made that explicit. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, so it's American slavery, Lincoln says, not Southern slavery, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That was March 4th. On April 4th, Lincoln visited the captured Confederate capital of Richmond, where he was thronged by freed people who shouted, "Glory, hallelujah," and fell to their knees in front of him. Lincoln said, "Stand up. Don't kneel to me. You must kneel only to God and thank him for your freedom. Liberty is your birthright. God gave it to you as he gave it to others, and it is a sin that you have been deprived of it for so many years." So for American Jews, who had been at best on the fence about slavery for most of the war, the parallels between the emancipation of African Americans and their own deliverance from Egypt were striking. And in the next few days, they would become inescapable. Passover 1865 began on April 10th, the day after Lee's surrender to Grant. Can you imagine what the discussions must have been like at those seders? Lincoln's assassination was 4 days later, during Passover, incidentally, on Good Friday, the day of the death of Jesus. On Shabbat Pesach, Rabbi Max Lilienthal of Cincinnati preached, "We have in 4 years advanced intellectually, morally, and politically more than other nations will in centuries to come. 4 years ago, how many of us were abolitionists? How many of us dreamt of the possibility that this sacred soil of liberty should be cleansed from the scourge of slavery? How many of us had moral courage enough to think that this great stain could be or should be removed from the brilliant escutcheon of the American people?" So 19th century American Jews watched the modern day Exodus unfold before their eyes, and it transformed the religion. Have you ever attended a Seder without Go Down Moses? And that doesn't happen in other countries. But world-changing influence extended beyond America. In researching this talk, I discovered an article which showed that the American Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves had a deep influence on a small group of Jews from Europe and Eretz Israel who became known as the precursors of Zionism. I can't tell you more about this article because it's so new that it's still behind the paywall, but I'll put it in the list of links that I'm putting in the chat. What I'm suggesting tonight is that without symbols like Juneteenth and the forthcoming Harriet Tubman $20 bill, and documents like the Emancipation Proclamation and Granger's General Order Number 3, the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July are empty vessels. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this nation. And what makes it a benefit to humanity is at risk as it has not been since the Civil War. So Juneteenth is not by any stretch only an African-American holiday. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to everyone who loves the promise of this country. And I think I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. So much to think about. I'm sure we're going to have some questions and comments, although I don't see any in the chat box yet. Are we all just stunned by all of this amazing information?
Terrific, absolutely terrific.
Thank you. Thank
We
you.
learned so much. It's amazing. So how much I don't know.
It looks like we have a question from Keith.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
so Rob,
Helen.
because teaching critical race theory is banned, could you give the same talk to a high school in the South? The same talk you gave tonight?
I had a wonderful experience doing teacher training programs in Texas. I did that twice. And trust me, there were already so many incredible restrictive laws about what could and what had to be taught in Texas that teachers there made an art form of working around the legislation and conveying actual knowledge to their students. And they were very proud of the fact. It was very much sort of like talking to political dissidents in Russia, I think. They got a kick out of resisting. So they've been doing it for much longer than than most of the rest of us. So I'd find a way.
Okay.
Looks like there is a question from Helene. Or I don't know if that was Isaiah.
Yeah, it was me. Um, Rob, you said something, I don't know, several minutes ago about 100-year history tying into something, and I didn't,
Exodus.
yeah, I didn't, it was, but I thought it had to do with something, during the Civil War, some 100-year period that was the
Oh,
critical
yes,
period.
right.
Akin to the 40 years in the desert, 40-year wandering.
Yeah, so the 40 years of wandering the desert, but in this country, it was literally a century between emancipation in 1865 and the passage of the
Voting
Civil
rights.
Rights Act of 1864 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that's the century that I'm referring to.
Thank you.
I should have made that a little bit clearer.
Oh, well, Corey, why don't you go first? And then Rabbi Woodward wrote something in. Go ahead.
Oh, Rob, thanks so much. I learned a ton, not the least of which is that you have great singing capability and musical history capability too. I wanted to come back to your question, hypothetical or just sort of imagine of what it was like for those celebrating Seder. And I'm raising it because over the last few decades, I've become aware of ancestors of mine who were in the South. I don't think there's anybody direct, but there's certainly brothers of people I'm descended, or sisters of people I'm descended to who were in Charleston. And going way back, there were people in Curacao who were, there as functionaries of some kind in the break bulk capital of the transatlantic slave trade. So what do we know about how they changed or where they ended up during the Civil War, and how they came to terms with their kind of embeddedness in the economy that was rooted in slavery?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that very well. I know more about some of the rabbis who were the northern rabbis who were apologists for slavery, and largely that was a matter of it was like being for every industry in the country in terms of its power.
Yeah.
And it was also a means of assimilating, right? Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise in Cincinnati, probably the most distinguished rabbi in the country at that point, counseled that the best course for American Jews to take was to be quiet on the subject. The most famous Southern Jew is probably Judah P. Benjamin, who was the first Secretary of State in the Secretary of Treasury, I guess, in the Confederacy, served in many different capacities, and was unquestionably the most capable Confederate functionary. And he didn't wait to see what his life would be like in the reunited United States. he spent the rest of his life in England in exile. So I don't know the impact that it had on people in the South. Of course, the many Southerners, as we know from the lynching of Leo Frank in Atlanta in the early 20th century, turned back to the traditional prejudice that could reunite all Southerners and became extreme anti-Semites. But that was not typical of the South.
Thank you.
Tell you more.
So there are a couple of items in the chat. If
Yeah.
those who were able to read Rabbi Woodward's, you'll recognize why. He's tight and not speaking. He raped the family. But I guess just to give voice to it, he expressed interest in the discussion of holiday symbols. The idea that July 4th wasn't big in the antebellum South is fascinating. And the need to tie July 4th to Juneteenth today feels so clear to me, maybe even a sustained period of time, like a Yamim Noraim of the summer for our country. Can you reflect on what we can do to help think of how our own Jewish holiday observance might be enlivened?
That's a superb question. I'm going to pass the buck on that and turn it back to Eric and to you all as something that might come out of this talk, because I think it makes a great deal of sense. What I'm suggesting is that events like these and Martin Luther King Day, there are others that that are treated as individual commemorations, really do need to be seen in a very close parallel to the Jewish sacred cycle, as complementing each other and completing each other and providing new insights into each other. So I completely agree with that interpretation. I guess what is required and where our Jewish experience is the most useful, what is required is to understand that even secular time is sacred time. That the passage of time in the United States of America is not so different from the time that we look at in Jewish history. It doesn't end with Jewish history. Doesn't end with the Bible. It goes through the Mishnah and Talmud and straight through to to the present day. And I think we need to look at American history in the same way and to recognize that there is a link between the two. Ironically enough, my friend Thomas Jefferson, whose book Notes on the State of Virginia I've been annotating for about the last 10 years, and who I don't have a great deal of affection for in this particular issue, his original model for his plan for the Great Seal of the United States was Moses leading the children of Israel, parting the sea and leading them out of Egypt. I think the two are really deeply intertwined. it's, you will see this biblical language throughout the, well, 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century. It really is universal until it begins to be pared back in the late 19th and 20th century. But people saw this country as part of the same story as that they were reading about in the Bible and they were hearing sermons on Sunday. History was alive and not dead. I guess that's one way to put it.
So Jay also asked one in the chat, and he's wondering about other countries' view of our story of slavery. He says all countries had their own slavery and emancipation, but usually without violence. Is the American slavery experience taught in France and England, for example? Is this an American story? And making the connection that Black Lives Matter has spread from the US to Europe, will Juneteenth become international? We'll go to Jennifer next.
That is truly happening. It is becoming there's great attention being paid right now to the process of Juneteenth becoming a national holiday, and I think you'll see that progressing as time goes on. One thing though one point that I would make is that the first experience of liberation and experiences in classical history that the early Americans had to draw on, almost all emancipations were violent. And the classic example that they had in front of their faces was the Haitian Revolution. So when they talked about freedom for the slaves being accompanied by catastrophic violence, they weren't predicting the future, they were describing the recent past, which helps to understand why there was such incredible resistance, besides the fact that it was their entire livelihoods.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for this talk. So I have a question about the Exodus and or the notion of Exodus, of trying to enter something that could be conceived of as a promised land that freed people would be part of. And it's a constant frustration, right? And so there's continual exoduses. So there's the migration out of the South in the 1910s, or even really in the 1890s, right?
Yeah.
And then in the 1910s, and yet it doesn't actually lead to that liberation. It becomes so frustrating. And then there's the 1940s and thinking that, okay, Chicago is really going to be the place, or Detroit or New York. And now we will have arrived at, what was called the Promised Land, right? Chicago is called the Promised Land. And it doesn't happen again. And then you have the movement to the West Coast, to Oakland, which, really turned out to be shit, or even, Las Vegas, which, it even in the 60s and 70s was a totally Jim Crow city. And so, what happens with this, this construct of we're going to have an exodus that is going to bring us to a place of liberation, and yet, in fact, it's perpetually met with repression, right, and marginalization.
Yeah, well, this is really, I mean, and one of the dates that is going to have to go on our calendar is January 6th, right? This is a struggle. It is a continuing struggle. It's the same struggle in many ways that it has been, you know, going way, way back. And the crux of the matter is, you know, Lincoln in the second inaugural address paints a picture of a sacred story, the point of which is freedom, right? And if you to accept this as your story, and to agree to acknowledge that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, you have to accept the humanity of Blacks. And the function that Blacks are serving for the people who have been fighting them, you know, for centuries, is to be a displacement for the things that they for the things that are mortal and venal and shameful about themselves.
And actually, yes, we were just asking, you know, in a conversation I was having with some other people, what are the moments in which Jews also become that?
Exactly.
You know, what are the moments in which, you know, Jews suddenly serve at, you know, it's always latent, I mean, anti-Semitism, but when does that come to the surface as, you know, the chief threat to the nation and the social body and the idea of purity? But I wanted to add something else about the music. When you were singing the song about the march through Georgia, one of the pieces actually I play for my students, because I'm teaching the 20th century, is Dizzy Gillespie, when he does Manteca, you know, and he's drawing on the Afro-Cuban rhythms, and in thinking about the kind of increasing politicization of bebop is, you know, there's a version that starts off by saying, I'll never go back to Georgia. I'll never go back to Georgia. You know, like, I'm just not going to play those segregated gigs anymore and stay in, you know, enter the back door. And so that becomes the announcement for the song, which then begins. And then the other song, which I think kind of is a good bookend for those 1860s songs, is the Staple Singers song, When Will We Be Paid for the Work We've Done?
Yeah.
It goes through like every era of, you know, of labor that Blacks have had to do in America.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent.
It's a little bit after 9. Does anybody else have any questions or comments that they'd like to get in before we end? Well, then I will thank you, Rob, for sharing your wonderful scholarship with us once again. So much information, so much learning, and I hope that this is just the big, you know, maybe this is the first discussion of Juneteenth, and maybe next year we'll do something more formally celebratory, or you know, just a different way of acknowledging the day. But I thought it was really great for us to learn about it.
If people will hang on just for a second, I'm going to put in the chat some links that you might find of interest. Copy and paste. Chat.
And while you do that, I will remind people that next Wednesday there is not a schmooze, because we are having Becky's annual meeting on Monday evening at 7 o'clock on Zoom. So that's going to be all the fun and entertainment you can stand for the whole week, I think. It's going to be, there's a lot of interesting, fun things that are going to happen. The following week, Miriam Kabakov, who some of you know, who was a Becky member for a while and is now living in Northampton, Massachusetts, is going to be talking to us about LGBTQ issues and Judaism, and helping us to raise our consciousness about another set of people who are often excluded and how we can do a better job of making them feel included in our community. So that'll be on the 30th. And then just keep your eyes open for what's going on beyond that. Thank you again, and check out the links that Rob sent, because I'm sure they'll be fascinating as his talk was. So thank you very much, and everybody have a great night.
Thanks.
Yeah.